name is Catherine Whalen, and I'm assistant professor here at the Bard Graduate Center. I'm very pleased to welcome Sandy Isenstadt to the Modern Design History Seminar here at the BDC, which is convened by myself and professors Pat Kirkham, Paul Sturgeon, and Michelle Major. Sandy Isenstadt is professor of art history at the University of Delaware, where he is also the director of the Center for Material Culture Studies, where he just convened a very successful conference entitled Survivor Objects, the Material Culture of Memory. Professor Isenstadt received his BA in architecture from Washington University in St. Louis and his Master of Architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he also completed his PhD in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture. Prior to his appointment at Delaware, Professor Isenstadt was at Yale University and University of Kentucky and a practicing architect. His work has been recognized with fellowships from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Graham Foundation, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts in Washington, D.C. Professor Isenstadt's research and publications have focused on post-World War II formulations of modernism, primarily by émigré architects such as Richard Neutra, Joseph Louis Sert, and Henry Klum, the visual polemics in the urban proposals of Leon Creer and Rem Koolhaus, and histories of American refrigerators, picture windows, landscape views, and real estate appraisal. His book, The Modern American House, Spaciousness and Middle-Class Identity, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2006. This acclaimed study describes the visual enhancement of spaciousness in the architectural interior and landscape design of American domestic architecture. With Kishwar Rizvi, he is co-editor of Modernism and the Middle East, Politics of the Built Environment. Published by University of Washington Press in 2008, it is the first book-length treatment of modern architecture in the Middle East. Professor Isenstadt is co-editor with Margaret Maley-Petty, who's a BGC graduate, and Dietrich Neumann of Cities of Light, 2 Centuries of Urban Illumination, forthcoming from Routledge in February. Among his current projects are The Rise and Fall of Modern Shopping, which focuses on the spatial infrastructure of shopping as it changed from the Renaissance through today, and Electric Modernism, his ongoing study of the cultural reception of electric lighting, from which his talk tonight is drawn, titled Turned On by a Touch, the Light Switch in Everyday Life. This event is being live streamed by BGC TV, and you can join the discussion after the talk via Twitter. Please use the Twitter hashtag Bard Graduate Center TV. I will be monitoring the Twitter feed during the talk and drawing questions from it. So, thank you, Sandy, so much for coming tonight.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming out on this raw night. I thought what I would do is start by giving you an overview of the larger project that tonight's talk is drawn from. The titles varied from electric modernism to the architecture of artificial light. And essentially what I've been engaged in for the last number of years has been to try to bring together the technical history of electric lighting and also some of the cultural responses to electric lighting. And I'm actually trying to do something very, very conventional, which is to write an architectural history of electric light. And by that I mean not the way that electric light enhanced already existing buildings or brightened already existing spaces, but actually generated new building types, new spatial types. And I think that reveals a whole new set of social spaces that I would like to think of as a way to describe the advent of modernity, but not through avant-garde formulations of modernity. So I'm interested in non-avant-garde formations that are quite conflicted in many cases. So we do have studies of architects making the most of electric light. You can see here one of Mendelssohn's designs for the Schocken apartment building in the 1920s, and the Germans were really probably quite adept at this. What I'm interested in is the very fitful start that architects had in engaging with lighting engineers, the changes and the kind of cultural struggles that occurred between a whole range of different constituencies that effectively rewrite what it is to be outside at night, rewrite our whole relationship with the nighttime. So in that regard, the chapters in this particular book, and I'm hoping by a year from now it is a draft. The first one concerns the automobile headlight, that cone, that mobile cone of light that has dimension. It has an inside and an outside. It has a front and a back. It really matters where you are in that space and when you are in that space. It's a space that's designed very carefully by automobile engineers and lighting experts. It's regulated by cities. It's actually adjudicated in courts of law. There are a lot of court cases about when you can use headlights. We don't think about it anymore after headlights became standardized and national headlighting codes were established in 1939. But for some time, this was a really striking cultural space, I would say, that conflicts with other sorts of spaces. So there's a great literature on automobile headlights. Not surprisingly, that blinding shaft of light penetrating the darkness is a highly gendered space as well, particularly with male drivers. It's got a kind of urban, rural divide in it. It was seen as an urban technology. So this is just one of the spaces I'd like to talk about. Another involves workspaces that are so rewritten by lighting engineers as to effectively become a different kind of space. So the argument in this chapter, and I'll focus on factory workspaces, is that vision becomes a factor of production, and these workspaces are effectively visually tailorized. So vision itself gets tailorized to fit into productive activities. Another section will be on Times Square, and I'm kind of moving up in scale from the smallest up to the largest scale. So this is Times Square, and I'd like to talk about Times Square as an urban district of illuminated commercial speech that eventually goes worldwide, but for the moment of its formation and really the late 19th and early 20th century is quite a unique space and engenders a new kind of urban reading, a new way to be in the city and sorts of activities. And the discussions of Times Square just cross all kinds of disciplinary lines. So you can just see, from just a photograph from the first decade of the 20th century to traffic engineering magazines. There are police journals it appears in, just in a lot of different modes. And then the last chapter will be on blackouts, what I've called scotopic space. And scotopic simply means vision under little or no light, low lighting conditions. So daylight is photopic. You enjoy photopic vision in the daytime. In a blackout, after decades of increasing illumination, I want to argue that this sudden retreat into kind of pre-electric conditions was understood in spatial terms. And you find a lot of really interesting literature, again, across disciplines, from medicine, talking about people who were well adapted to see in the dark, to investing. Barron's and Fortune talk about how to invest in the light of, or in the light, so to speak, in the dark of the blackout. And you can imagine where they go with that. You short sell rubber manufacturers because people will be driving less, so tires will wear out less frequently. You buy stock in glass companies because there will be more accidents involved in glass. So it's really kind of fascinating. And this also gets incredibly gendered as well. So again, my point here is that there are a series of spaces that are generated by electric light, or after decades of generated light are generated by the absence of electric light. And you see, of course, in Norman Rockwell, Saturday Evening Post cover, What to Do in a Blackout. The woman is attentively reading, and he's thinking of what he would do in a blackout. On the other side are nurses who are learning how to give first aid in a blackout. So they are, you can see they're blindfolded, but they have the patients beneath them. So that's the overall talk. What I want to do today is start at the smallest scale, that is the light switch. And I'd like to make the argument that the light switch was actually one of the most visually startling and personally empowering actions at the start of the 20th century. You flipped a switch and a room would just rocket into invisibility. It became quite a kind of popular, small-scale, miniature theater, you can imagine, of the theater of the switch, and ends up having, becomes a kind of political theater as well. So, with that, let's talk about the switch. Pope Paul VI, in 1965, from his apartment in the Vatican, pressed a button and illuminated the statue of Cristo Redentor in Rio de Janeiro on Mount Corcovado, overlooking the entire city. It's really unlikely that the Pope actually lit the statue from his apartments in the Vatican. What most likely happened is that he sent a radio signal to someone who was operating, who threw the actual switches. Nevertheless, the Pope's role was played up in all accounts of the event. So here's a quote from a newspaper at the time. Quote, "At the stroke of 12, Pope Paul VI touched a button in the Vatican and illuminated the figure of Christ the Redeemer that overlooks the city from atop Corcovado Mountain." End quote. In making a figure of God visible to man, the Pope relied on several characteristics of electric lighting that indeed related to divine action. First, it can be exercised at a great distance. The Pope, for instance, was half a world away when he pressed the button. Second, it is effortless to operate. The Pope touched a button, that's all he had to do. And third, it's instantaneous. Finally, despite all the technological mediation, electric light partakes of light's ancient iconography, a literary and pictorial trope heavy with biblical significance and the subject of voluminous investigation. Today, though, rather than engage the long history of light, I would like to talk about the button. So the switch itself is a very simple device. And in fact, in trying to think about it etymologically, it really relates to any sort of control of some kind of flow. So you can even think of valves as controlling the flow of water, or dams or sluices as a kind of switch. And valve itself comes from a Latin term that refers to the leaf of a door. So it controls your movement through a space. And you see here images from Alessandro Volta showing his cell battery, and he didn't have an independent switch, but just by manipulating the conductive elements that you can see there is effectively controlling the flow, stopping or starting the flow of electricity in the battery. And I should say that there is a field of control engineering. It doesn't really have a proper history, but it's an entire applied science. But when I looked at that literature, I noticed that it's all about feedback mechanisms, and it's an active field right now. What's not included in control engineering are these simple switches that are really just the subject of our ordinary will. So willful action is not part of that history. That's exactly what I'd like to create a history of, this kind of cultural study of switches. And I really think that the little switch is what changes our relationship to our immediate environments, and helps kind of shape our relationship with particular environments. So just a quick look at some of the patent history of the electric light. In some ways, the switch seems obvious, but when we look at, I think it's an 1881 patent by Thomas Edison, where he's showing how to use the electric lighting, how to wrap it around, use the existing gas piping in a house as the armature for the bulbs and also as a ground. And he even calls this a complete system of electric lighting. There's actually no switch mechanism in it. It's kind of a curious oversight. The next year, he has this lamp with a switch that screws into the base, and the base has the electricity going through it. There's an insulator around the outside, and then this screw actually goes through there and touches the base of the lamp. So to me it seems radically dangerous. But what he's saying is you actually get a dimming effect by screwing it tighter or looser. I think you would just get sparks. But the idea was to have a self-contained unit. And the switch itself is really kind of hard to find through the patents because, again, it's such an old notion. And the term itself, when we think of the switch, as far as I can understand, the etymology of it comes from a riding switch. That is the long stick you use to smack a horse's butt to get it to move faster. And it was first really used in regard to telegraph keys, which have a stick-like extension and also incite a kind of action. So that then becomes our word switch. And these are just different examples, the universal switch in different sorts of conditions. And there are really hundreds and hundreds of patents for these. This is probably a little bit more familiar, the 1 and 2 button switches. There are lots of studies, just again, a lot of examples of this. So I don't think there's an switch, a single switch I could point to, but I could find some of the patents that are cited more than others. Many people see their first incandescent lights at expositions where inevitably the lights are turned on simultaneously. And so there's usually this moment at dusk when the lights would all go on. So here you can see the Edison Tower in the Electricity Building at the 1893 fair in Chicago, and then when it's illuminated. And here's an account of it from 1893. At night, the glories of electricity are tenfold revealed in the hall of electricity. By the silent touch of an unseen hand, the Edison light tower is suddenly illuminated. Other buttons touched, revealed throughout the hall the splendid workings of mind with that subtle something which is called electricity, till the whole became a marvelous fairyland. And at the Chicago fair, Grover Cleveland was the one who pressed the button. And he actually had a gold-plated button on a pedestal that said 1492, 1893. So he's completing, the completion of the electrical circuit was also seen as a completion of a historical circuit. It was reported that 100,000 people showed up to witness that event, to see him touch a button. And again, just some accounts from the time. Quote, when he touches the button, every wheel starts. Every process of beautiful production goes on before our eyes, end quote. And Cleveland himself used the touching of the button and the completion of the circuit to light the lights as an allegory for American ideals in his own speech. So you have to imagine he's got his finger over the button when he's saying this. Quote, as by a touch, the machinery that gives life to this vast exposition is now set in motion. So at the same instant, let our hopes and aspirations awaken forces which in all time to come shall influence the welfare, the integrity, the freedom of mankind, end quote. So there's something that's captured, I think, in that statement of that instantaneous transition that suggests a kind of, as Cleveland put it, a kind of permanent state of becoming, which I think is particularly appropriate to a nation that's right on the verge of entering the world stage. In many ways, the 1893 exposition was a kind of American entry on the world stage. And so again, as a result of this, as a result of Cleveland summoning all this power by this minimal touch, he appears kind of Olympian in the same way. So here's another statement from the, this is an article or a news piece called "The President Presses the Button." Quote, where was he? Invisible, somewhere else. When he touches the button, every wheel starts, every process of beautiful production goes on before our eyes. And then that continues, we do not see him, perhaps we forget him. But had we looked, we should have found his finger at the keyboard of the universe. So it's quite a powerful idea. And I would say from 1876 to 1937 World's Fair in Paris, light, either electricity or light, was a theme, an explicit theme of all of these fairs, and the switches were present in a lot of the promotional literature of those fairs. So here you can see the 1901 fair in Buffalo. And this is the panorama that appears in the first night movie. You can find this on YouTube. It's the first night film ever made. It's just this slow pan of the grounds at Buffalo. But then importantly, all the switches, and the copy here, you can't quite read it, points to this little switchway back there, and it says all of these big switches are operated by this little switch. And again, there's this kind of fascination with the fact that these gigantic systems with enormous infrastructures are operated by such a tiny means. And I think part of the drama of the switch is that while there was an enormous amount of work that goes on, say, to creating the Edison Tower, or creating these light effects on the Buffalo Fairgrounds, it's that moment of switching it on that brings it to, literally, to light. It's hard to avoid the puns, I'm sorry. But it comes across as a kind of revelation, and for that reason, the switch was often referred to as the magic button. And again, I'm talking about this moment when it was all still quite new. So you find this reference to magic again and again with switches, and this is a particularly fascinating case of the Habershaw Cable Company. There were, in about 1915, there were probably about 50 wire and cable companies in the United States, and Habershaw was probably listed around number 30 in terms of sales. But they understood the problem that they provided an infrastructure for something everybody wanted but nobody saw. Nobody really, a homeowner didn't specify the wiring. But what they started to do, and it was something that had been pioneered, I think, by Anderson Windows, that started putting its name on the windows so home buyers could see their product around 1901 or 1902. Habershaw didn't have anything you could see, but they started advertising in popular periodicals, introducing the electrical contractor to the broader population. And here, they're explaining that the magic of the switch depends upon all this hidden infrastructure and associating it with their name. And the idea was that architects and electrical contractors would start to specify Habershaw wiring, because that was the only thing customers knew about their wiring. They had a name. And in fact, they ended up becoming, their sales increased, in 5 years their sales increased 2,000-fold, and they became the largest manufacturer. And they were absorbed, but they're still, in a way, around. So again, the theme of magic we see throughout, and I think that is part of the power of the switch. Is it exploits something that a philosopher of technology named Albert Boardman described as the device paradigm. And the device paradigm essentially means that we are interested in the benefits of technology, but not necessarily the technology itself. So you're interested in the picture you get from your TV. You don't want to see the big box. And this is, I think, part of the impetus for screens getting flatter and flatter built into walls. We're interested in the benefit of warmed air. We don't want the furnace in the same room. So we really want the production of whatever commodity is to be somewhere else, and we want just the commodity. So this is what Boardman called the device paradigm, and the switch, I think, is the kind of the fact that there are these cyclopean machines that are operating, and you don't know anything about what's going on or how they operate. That's part of the magic. That's part of the pleasure of the switch. So by the late 1890s or so, there was talk about an age of buttons, and it's kind of surprising how many discussions there are of this. For instance, an 1898 newspaper editorial titled "Touching the Button" began We are nowadays getting used to doing things easier and further off than we used to. Deeds of grandeur or deeds of terror are accomplished with less immediate effort and at a distance from their effect. The touch of a button executes a murderer or starts all the enginery of the Columbian Exposition. Is this not somewhat the way that God works? End quote. And coincidentally or not, you have the electrical light, and you know these descriptions of where to put lights. This is actually from about 1915, and I don't know if you can read the copy, but this is someone who becomes so accustomed to pressing buttons. He's a kind of the man of the future. We will grow these incredibly sensitive fingers to press all the buttons of our time. And in fact, in engineering journals, there was some discussion about consumers wanting everything to be push button, and the engineers couldn't even keep up with that. So we have this the age of buttons, and then I also show you the Kodak camera, which is more or less introduced at the 1893 fair, widely used there at least. And their ad campaign was famously, and this is in the history of advertising, this is supposedly the first really great advertising campaign, and it was, you press the button, we do the rest. So it's really about, again, sort of pressing the button. And then I just have some other examples. Again, these are from, this is probably 1915 or so. A man who, this is a detail from, that image right there. He's just pressing buttons. It's the push button life. And so there's this kind of projection forward into what the world means if in this electric and push button world. And I couldn't help but think of George Cruikshank when he made similar sorts of images about the advent of the steam power and the application of steam power to everything, brought to this kind of almost ridiculous point. So there's a lot of imagery again about the magic. In this case, this is a Norman Rockwell image. And part of the point here is not just reading in bed, but also to show the safety of the electric light. So you can see the wire there is prominently displayed. Not a good place for wire in a bedroom at night, but the point is that the electric light is safe. There was a lot of concern initially about just the safety of it. In fact, the writer James Thurber commented in one of his essays about how his mother used to be afraid that the electricity would leak out of the outlets, that it would start falling on the floor. So I think there's some general concern about that. And again, there's a lot of literature about where to put the outlets, how to electrify rooms, where to put switches, discussions about, to have them at the door. Wiring companies like Habershaw would create plans to show architects how to wire houses, because at this point there are maybe a few thousand what they were called illuminating engineers. That is, not quite lighting designers, more electrical engineers specializing in lighting. And architects had to learn a lot of this material on their own. Here, another image showing where you might place switches in the house. You can see the most prominently articulated pieces are the switches. And then just the benefits of having switches in various places. I personally think the one on the right is a very good idea. You don't see that quite enough, the switch at the bed. So really this is what we could talk about as an age of buttons, but there's also this sort of darker side, because there's also this notion that the sudden shift in a room from darkness to light also posed a kind of threat. And so we actually get in the early 20th century a kind of subgenre of thriller literature, which has come to be called wire thrillers. And it's in response to the growing electrification and also the rise of telecommunications, these networks of wires everywhere. So this is just a quote from The Wiretappers, where the woman, the she in this, has, her husband had the house wired for electricity, so she comes to know a lot about electricity, but she's in someone else's house now. And she's, as the text goes, quote, "The wiring of the house," she had already noticed with the quickness of an expert, "was both thorough and modern. Any moment the turning of a bedside button might flood the room with brilliant light and leave her there, betrayed beyond redemption." So again, in this sort of, throughout this literature, the rooms blaze into light, people kind of inch their way along walls looking for light switches, secrets are revealed, suspicions confirmed, and plots kind of moved forward by the light switch. And again, I think it forms a motif, so alongside, say, a Gothic motif of a gloomy person sitting in a gloomy house, you can think of Edgar Allan Poe, I think there's this other motif in late 19th, early 20th century literature of the transformative moment of a literal kind of enlightenment, this sudden jolting extension of self triggered by the otherwise unnoticed switch. And these are just examples. I mean, you can see the reversibility of the network of wires where the figure of electricity is connecting to all these wonderful conveniences. At the same time, this is the kind of web of wires that's spreading over throughout the entire nation. So the phrase itself, the press of a button, there are other variations such as the press of the key, the turn of a switch, and later on the flip of a switch, was really quite compelling before it became the cliche it is today. And the earliest instance I can find of that kind of phrasing is actually from the naval use of torpedoes. I'm not completely sure of the mechanism, but it certainly comes to public consciousness through the telegraph, which is, famously collapses time and space. And as an example, something that was written about the telegraph and then later on the telephone, describing kind of arc of historical arc through electricity. The old notions of force, space, and resistance are gone. We are surrounded by some mysterious power. We have chained a giant that we do not know. At present, he gives us light and speeds us to the farthest point. His limit of endurance for us is as extensive as the earth, and at the press of a button, he answers to our call. So again, part of the power of this is this immediate transformation of the entire visual environment. I've been trying to think of how to describe this as a space, and because it's the result of the user's volition or will, I've been calling it volitional space, though that's not the most enchanting of terms. So if anyone has some ideas, just the idea that you could suddenly will a visual space into being really for the first time in the history. So for all of these reasons, the switch stars in this kind of common performance of on and off. It registers, again, this sort of Olympian power to project a kind of realm of authority well beyond the proximity of fingertip and switch. And for this reason, you find it as an absolute staple of political theater. So the actors were varied. They ranged from homeowners to mayors to presidents and eventually, as we saw, popes. But the plot was always the same. A crowd assembles, a finger conspicuously touches a button, and a vision instantly appears as if the will of a people were concentrated into the fingertip of a designated agent and transmuted into radiance and accomplishment. An intention is formed, and in an instant, heedless of distance, it is so. It is somewhat the way that God works. So one of the favorites of American presidents was lighting Christmas trees. And it only went on afterwards because the guy who actually had the switches missed the cue. And then I found this literally the other day. I couldn't have been happier. So let's see if it comes up.
By dialing 1964, I launched the final phase of this great effort.
There it is. So the World's Fair. And again, I think part of the point here is that the minimal haptic gesture results in the greatest optical result. And it's part of that power that creates this kind of theater of the switch. So I'll just very quickly go through, kind of bring it a little bit up to date. Because theater is in fact the place where switches matter most. And this is well understood at the time, that theaters were the building type where controls mattered most. And precisely in terms of this device paradigm, you don't want to see the machinery, you just want to see the effects. And I should say, theaters were, in the 19th century, the building type most liable to fire, because lighting controls were pioneered for gas lighting, and they were very interested in having controls that could operate all the gas lights at once, turn them all on at once, or turn them all off at once. It's harder to do with gas than it is with electricity, and I think as a result, there were a lot of fires. So this is well recognized at the time. In 1907, in the Illuminating Engineer, a trade journal for the electrical industry, one article titled "Lights of the Stage" began, "In no place in the world, unless it is a coal mine, is lighting of as much importance as it is on the stage. The success or the failure of a production may actually be decided by the skill of the men behind the scenes in managing the lights." And so lighting was regularly a subject of discussion. This is Norman Bel Geddes' 1924, or an image of Bel Geddes' 1924 production for The Miracle at the Century Theater in New York. This is actually from Scientific American, because it was the most elaborate lighting control device, switchboard, ever designed. And you might know about this total transformation of the theater. And so there were a number of key theater lighting designers who actually become the first architectural lighting designers. People like Bassett Jones or Abe Fetter. Bel Geddes would be part of that. Lee Simonson was part of that. And lighting is increasingly recognized for its effect in theater. What was sort of interesting to me, and weirdly, I went through a bunch of playbills, the things you get at the theater. So what I found was that in the 1930s, scenic designers are recognized, lighting designers are not, for about 80% of the time. Credits start inching up by the 40s and 50s, and by the early 60s, most playbills will credit the lighting designers. And it's actually not till 1962 that lighting designers are admitted to the United Scenic Artists Union, finally putting them on a footing with their other set design colleagues. Central to this success is dimmers. This is probably more about switches and dimmers than you were prepared to know, but so dimmers were a really interesting technology. What you see on the left is the first real electrical dimmer. It's a salt water, it's a cylinder of salt water, and a big dial here, and then two electrodes that would control the lighting. And so the greater contact of electrode and salt water, the brighter the lights would be. This had a lot of problems in that salt water evaporates. It can corrode the electrodes. If you get an arc between the electrode and the salt water, it makes this horrible stench, apparently. These were replaced over time. And there are a lot of interesting technological developments. Initially, you can only have linear reductions in the line voltage because of the technology, but that has to do with the amount of electricity getting to whatever the lighting the lamp is. And it has very little to do with how the eye sees. So lighting controls start being designed more closely with the acuity and sensitivity of vision, and again, start appearing in scientific journals as genuine advances of the time. The best known, probably the first person to teach lighting design, is someone named Stanley McCandless, who is trained as an architect in the firm of McKinney & White, is at Harvard, but then is hired away when Yale starts its theater school. And at that time, theater and architecture and art are all part of the same school. So McCandless taught lighting design for the theater, but a lot of architects took his classes. These are some of his studies showing the effects of different kinds of lighting. And he was also a real genius at switchboards, so he has some patents on different kinds of controls. And although Eero Saarinen, who was at Yale at the time, never took a class with McCandless, Saarinen ended up hiring McCandless later on to do the lighting design for a number of projects. And this is the Kleinhans Auditorium in Buffalo, which still stands today. One of McCandless's students was named Richard Kelly. Some of you might know was probably the single best known lighting designer, very prominent in the post-war period. Went to Yale for his degree, took classes with McCandless. And I should say in his own home, McCandless didn't use dimmers because they were not residential scale items. They were really for theaters, and they're resistance dimmers, which means they dim by means of pulling away voltage that gets turned into heat rather than light. So you really needed equipment to cool them. Richard Kelly, who in fact is the guy who did the lighting for the Christ the Redeemer statue in Mount Corcovado, was a student of McCandless. He goes on to design a number of houses. This is the Morisani House in Litchfield, Connecticut, by Edward Durrell Stone. And it's a marvel of a house. It's got this kind of lighting bridge. It has lights on the outside. It has this fixture running around the entire outside. Here's a little detail of it. Alternating pink and blue lights with ribbed glass, and then this kind of mesh screen called Cool Shade that gave it some glitter. The living room, no, the whole house, interior, not exterior, had 45,000 watts of lighting. And I actually talked to the current owner of the house, who grew up in the house. He's the son of the people who built the house. And he said when the dining room dimmer stopped working, they had to replace it, and he took it out, and it was about 18 inches long. And as a kid, he noticed it always got hot because, you know, it was a theatrical grade dimmer. And even in this house, the bedroom is designed as a kind of theater set. You can see here the lighting controls that were in this little cabinet here. The parents controlled the lighting for the whole house and could see in the kids' bedrooms if their lights were on and turn them off. So there are banks and banks of dimmers, and Kelly also he designed the gearing as well, so it would be smooth and kind of fit with the architectural ideas. And the first, as far as I can tell, the first residential grade lighting control is in the 1950s by Lutron. It was called the Luxtrol. The Lutron archive actually just went to the Smithsonian like 2 years ago, so I haven't seen it yet, but I'm eager to. And you start actually getting discussions of dimmers and what they can do for your home. And what sort of fascinates me is this theatricalization of the domestic realm. So I think the switch has a huge role in that as well. And then this is just what I think is probably, this is from about 1961 in Better Homes and Gardens, what I think is the first spread of dimmers in popular literature. And this is actually Richard Kelly's apartment. And I've talked to people who were there, who remember going there, and how he had a control set under the dining room table, and guests would be at the table having dinner, and he would play with the controls while people were dining, and change the lighting, make the curtains. He had a kind of metallic fabric in the curtains and these small lights. And again, this is all before controls of today and LEDs. So, I think that lighting forms, and the switch in particular, is part of the whole history of modern architecture. It's a way that we need to think about modern architecture outside questions of style. And I think even here you can see it at the same moment. Modern architecture gets subject to criticism. It gets subject to a kind of parody. So the upper left is Jacques Tati's 1957 Playtime. On the right, you know him you know him well, right? 1962, the push, what we think of as the push button age in the 60s, but clearly preceded by something else. So really what I want to say is that this is an understanding of modern architecture that includes the ability to regulate visual space at will, and that in a way lighting controls, the switch in particular, make one of the most transcendent patterns of life on Earth provisional. The alternation of light and day is now subject to convenience or amusement, invariably summoned into being at the touch of a button. Is this not somewhat the way that God works? And just as a quick addendum, I don't know if we're at the end of the light switch or a new beginning. The lighting manufacturers like Philips on the left start talking about smart light switches which can do all sorts of things. On the other hand, with the advent of humans internalizing technologies and switches, you see Jean-Luc Picard in the Borg, and then also a kind of a device located in the eye switched by blinking or pressure or something like that. With this internalization of technologies, either it's certainly a new age of the switch. Where it's going, I'm not really sure. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for this really incisive analysis and fascinating evidence that brings to our attention something that's ubiquitous, right, but understudied and not thought about so much in our daily lives. So I open the floor to questions. First thing.
I'm just curious about, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, hi.
Oh, sorry. Actually, it's a comment, not a question. But I have had an interesting personal experience with the magic of light. My daughter's first word was the word light. I've never heard of any other child who isn't mommy or daddy or something like that, but hers was light, not pronounced like that. And the reason why it happened is just by some freak of fortune. I used to pick her up because she was little and take her around and let her turn on lights. And she felt that magic. So the first word she would say was light, meaning she wanted to touch the switch.
I think it's fallen beneath our attention today, but it was a kind of miracle in its day for a short period of time.
Probably as children we had that too, we just don't remember.
So yeah, my question, I guess it's a comment and a question, but I'm really fascinated by this device paradigm idea, and I'm also thinking about that the switch itself doesn't seem to ever be heavily aestheticized. You know what I mean? That it's always somewhat minimal or somewhat hidden. I mean, I can think of sort of switch plates that are a little bit ornate and sort of creepy, overly, I don't know, sort of, Victorian throwback houses or something, but mostly it seems as though it remains somewhat hidden or somewhat de-emphasized. And I'm wondering if that's something that's at all, that you've thought about at all, and if it does relate somehow to this idea of the kind of Wizard of Oz, of kind of keeping everything behind the scenes, and you want this very minimal thing that seems kind of understated, and this maybe part of the magic is also this hiddenness, right? The mystique is maintained by that minimal interface.
Yeah, I think it's between a potentially aestheticized component of the home or whatever space it's in and a technological system. And I think that's part of the problem, is that it's a piece of technical equipment, so you buy it off the shelf. Light switch plates are where there was some interest, and so there are a couple of architect-designed switch plates. I didn't show you one today. I have a great image of Frank Furness. Had a devil's face with 2 holes for the eyes, and he mounted the two-button push switch. He mounted it sideways, and then put the switch plate over that, so you press the eyes of the devil to turn it on and off. So there are some examples of that, but then I also think there's this interest. Initially, sometimes switches were placed in quite prominent locations because it was a big deal. But then I think pretty quickly, once it gets ubiquitous, you want it minimized. And we definitely see that today, you know, with sounds or gestures that turn on lights, electric eyes or something like that. But I still think it's volitional, because even if it's done automatically, it's about the user's desire for that effect. So it's, and that's what I'm kind of fascinated about, is that it's a technical device, but user's volition is built into the technology. It's a kind of unrecognized part of the technology. And then, yeah, I think the device paradigm is a really useful way to talk about it. And in this Albert Borgman's telling of it, you want the device to disappear entirely in favor of the commodity delivered. I think with the switch, you still want that just fingertip touch, right? That minimal haptic gesture, because that demonstrates the power.
I was gonna say, I think that kind of changed through time with fashions as well. I'm from Schenectady, upstate, where my dad worked for General Electric, and I was obsessed with switches and lights it's kind of ingrained in me. But in my grandmother's house, in the dining room, built in 1952, they moved there for General Electric as well. But I remember the dining room, this humongous light switch plate cover that was like a fashion piece around the dimmer, and how it really like called you, like turn it on and touch it. On the flip side, in our back bathroom, my father had, in the late 60s, bought an image of a man flashing with his jacket open and the light switch, which I was forced to turn on and off every time I went to the restroom. But, you know, we had houses. We had houses near us that were built in the 20s, you know, in upstate too. And it's funny how many families just didn't bother to update, and they had the old churn circular switches, whereas, not it was celebrating electricity, but you had to do it. And they had the, what do they call the post and wire? Well, yeah, when the wires went up the wall and you saw them go through the wall with the insulated ceramic. But it's just interesting to see how in the 50s in my grandmother's house it was this celebrated magic with like the soft touch switches, they made the glowing ones. But it was all like a fashion kind of thing, and by the 70s it became a theme show.
I just had some thoughts about that as well, because it does seem to me, you know, there's one thing about minimalism, but also, you know, at various stages, very, very elaborate, and, you know, maybe the flasher is the joke, but a lot with roses and things, and I mean, I think it's about alternative modernism and alternative histories that, you know, I know you're interested in, so there might even be a whole thesis in the kind of switch. Like, I've never had a dimmer before till my current house, and it's like, it's still quite magical to me, and it actually made me think about, you know, how American, as a Brit, growing up with Hollywood films and things, that I always thought of things as very American, and I mean, I think some comparative studies will flow after yours. What else was I thinking about? I mean, I really love the prehistories. I've had done a lot of work on electricity in the home, and it's interesting, the images you were showing, you know, of wiring companies, they take you into the interior, don't they? And they took, I think you showed 3 images. It's the family and it's warm. It's like Christmas cards, really, you know. I thought that was interesting. Lost my point about what I was going to say about those. But to me, in the 20s anyway, the magic comes from it being instantaneous. That's what it seems magic, isn't it? It's abracadabra. Those two things seem to be fairly inseparable. And if the dimmer's on really low, it's not such a magical thing. It's most magical when, you know, he is lighting up the world. He is being God or something. And so, for me, that double connection. My third thought was, you know, because some of you know, I'm, you know, grew up in the coal mining area, the daughter of a coal miner, so that comment how I said coal mines, and I'm thinking, well, for me, that's maybe the place where the light switch is extremely dramatic, you know, because once you don't have candles and once you don't have Davy lamps, then what I remember is playing with the lamp on my dad's pit helmet, which actually has a battery, but you switch it on and off. And that was what we were always playing with, and my mother would say, you mustn't run the, you know, you mustn't run the battery down, because they have, you know, and it actually reminded me rather of the cinema, that when you switch that on in a coal mine, then you get this incredible
Right.
shaft of light.
Right. No, I thought it was quite astute that commented, except for coal mines,
Yes,
theater's the most important.
Yeah.
And to recognize exactly that. And I think you're right. I think the instantaneity, I mean, that is, I would say it's the instantaneity and action at a distance,
Yeah.
which are really quite unique and quite powerful, and I think quite modern. You know, in terms of, if you think of modern life as accelerating the pace of everything, you don't get much faster than instantaneous. And this is instantaneity writ small. Again, I think part of my interest is that these are, you know, big infrastructures, and there are plenty of histories of the electrical industry. But, you know, it's really the kind of cultural history and the everyday life component that I'm drawn to in this. Yep.
You mentioned the inevitable puns, and I heard the Age of Enlightenment, that this is coming up during that time, and sort of hyper-rationalization when you can see things, but also, even more so, the bringing light into the darkness of the unconscious, that this technology is rising at the same time as psychoanalysis. And I've been thinking about, you know, what that could mean in relation to what you're saying about the volitional quality or the theatralization of the domestic space, which could also be about somehow gaining control over the light and darkness in other realms as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the things that fascinates me, and I don't know quite how to come down on it in terms of a critical interpretation of the light switch, is that it seems to, on the one hand, return a sliver of agency to the user. So you have this giant infrastructure, and it feels like you have some control over it. You can say whether it's on or off. So there's a sense of agency. Or, on the other hand, are you simply now part of a really big machine? You know, you think you have will, just like you think you have choice in the marketplace.
Yeah, and just as you're eliminating the hidden darkness, you're also creating the hidden, or you're participating in the hiding of all that infrastructure.
Right. And one kind of curious thing that I've come across is, I would say, so in the U.S., the national electrical grids are completed right at the end of the 1920s and the start of the 1930s. And it's about that time that you start getting discussions about the loss of the night and what that's going to do to us in poetic terms and physiological terms. So there are actually discussions in medical journals about the atrophy of the cones in the eyes, because, you know, the rods are the black and white. So that these will atrophy because we never have low lighting conditions anymore. But the advantage is the cones will dominate, so we'll have better color differentiation. And this then comes out in discussions of blackouts, where they say city people will be at a disadvantage because they've evolved to not see at night, and we'll need rural people. I hadn't thought about the co-evolution of analysis and insights into the interior of the self. That's provocative. It's something I think about. Thanks. Yes?
I'm wondering about cold chain as the light switch, because I've been thinking a lot about Tiffany lamps and table lamps just after the turn of the century, where most of them are operated by a paddle switch, which is hidden, but then there are, at the same period, there are some where the cold chain kind of goes enticingly below the shade.
Right.
And it's a very different action, and it's more inviting, it's more visible, is it gendered, I don't know, but if you've thought at all about.
Yeah, no, I haven't, quite
the,
honestly.
The different meaning of.
Yeah, I haven't, I'm trying to think now why that didn't occur to me, and I think it's definitely worth looking at, and that tonight I'll go look at the patent database and see. Because you never know what the terminology was at the time. But I think maybe one reason, I'm just trying to think of my own reasoning, is that it's a very local light pole chain. You know, you're not turning on the lights of a room or, you know, some outdoor space. So it might be that because it's so local and intimate, and it kind of increases the sphere of the self in a way, but in a pool rather than a big space. But I think that distinction should be articulated in some way.
And I guess they're usually in multiples too, so it's sort of advertising that you have control over the amount. Of
But
light,
each fixture is separate,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great thing. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've looked into at all the post-war phenomenon of film noir, and how the psychology of light really kind of defined that genre of film and narrative in terms of just kind of coming at, you know, the end of this, you know,
Yeah.
this era.
To some extent, yes. I mean, there's obviously great literature on noir film, and I've thought about it in particular. I have an essay on lighting in Los Angeles, which is actually a really quite innovative city. It turns out the western United States cities were the more innovative, because the East Coast cities had big gas companies that said, no, we're not going to have electricity. And so they really resisted that. So the big light towers are in Austin or San Jose or Los Angeles. And Los Angeles has noir. And it also was an early adopter of neon. So what's the extent to which I've thought about noir is the role that neon's played in it. And neon you always see as, it always comes up in these movies. And it's in fact, it gets so, it becomes so associated, it's become so negatively associated that it really falls out of favor. So neon is played up in, say, Raymond Chandler as the kind of light that promises too much. You know, it's flashing, it's brightly colored, it says girls, 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 and it's always a big disappointment. And so this, you know, and it's all, or you see it in Chandler again, there's some poor slob in a hotel room and there's a light across the street that's flashing red across his ceiling all night as he's lying awake thinking about his own misdeeds or something like that. And what's particularly interesting is the Chandler books aren't made into movies until the 70s, I think. I don't know that any movies were made in his lifetime, or the bulk of them at least. And that's when neon started having a resurgence with postmodernism. Postmodernism rediscovers neon. So yeah, I mean, that's the extent to which and there's some great scenes. What is the famous Orson Welles movie with a really long tracking shot?
Touch of Evil.
Touch of Evil, right. So Touch of Evil, that tracking shot just had, it's like a...
And it's a night shot.
Yeah, it's a night shot, and I think it starts in neon, it has headlights, it's everything. I mean, I could have just shown that. And even there's a great passage in Farewell, My Lovely, I think, the Chandler book, where he's looking at a neon sign, and he said, the guy who invented neon should get a medal. He really made something out of nothing. And it's brilliant. It's a brilliant line. So yeah, I think there's probably more to do in that regard. Yes?
I have another question, but in regards to that, and that, a friend of mine who I thought I told to come here tonight, but said I didn't, his name's Thomas Rinaldi, who wrote the book New York Neon, I don't know if anyone's familiar, but he does a great talk about films and neon usage in that, so I can give you his information if you want.
Yeah.
And that would be a great piece and show you a bunch of film. But my question is kind of involved with that. One night was in a KO on YouTube looking at Times Square lights back in the day, and came across William Klein's Broadway by Light. I don't know if anyone's familiar, but you should look it up. It's on YouTube. It's great. But it's beautiful. It's shot, I think, in the 50s or the 60s, showing the Admiral sign, all the amazing lights. But my question is, have you ever done any research as far as the switches and the machines that would make all that mechanically happen, like the lights that flow across and down? It had to be huge.
It is huge, and it's quite interesting. I've done a little bit, and you know, the technology, it's card technology, and it's pre-computation, but they have cards. Essentially, as far as I can tell, there are each bulb is wired separately. You're talking about the big signs. So all the wiring, each bulb separately comes down to a room, and there's a kind of giant panel that's more or less the same size, but not the same size, the same shape, miniaturized. And you have these cards with little holes punched in them, and the cards are moving along a little belt, and there's a conductive surface underneath, and then contacts above. When the card passes, the contact is broken, and then where there's a hole, the contact is made, and that causes the light to flash. So if you think it through, you know, how to drink Coca-Cola or whatever it is, that's the technology. So it's not that complicated. It's the same for what they call the zipper signs, the new signs around like the Times building, or you just noticed, they probably do it differently now, electronically now, but something at Lincoln Center, walked by had a zipper. I thought it was pretty interesting. I should also say, I stopped at a Starbucks, and they had one of these devices you could bring for your, you know, some espresso machine, and said, enjoy all your favorite Starbucks treats at the press of a button. And I was like, there were too many other people there. I wanted to take it and use it as evidence, but they were caught. Yes.
Two things. Just to go back to an earlier point that you raised, just last night I was watching this film called A Canterbury Tale. It's a Powell and Pressburger film, made in 1942 to 43, which one of the themes running through it is that American soldiers don't understand the blackout. And this is a recurring theme throughout the film, much of which is filmed in darkness.
Oh, that's wonderful. And what's it called?
A Canterbury Tale. It's one of their less well-known films, but it's quite interesting. It's a propaganda film.
And who's it by?
Powell and Pressburger.
Okay.
They're quite famous in Britain. I thought they
They're very famous here too.
Wow. Well, that sounds great.
But I was thinking separately from that about I realised that much of your interest is in the domestic in this, and also, go back to your early distinctions, really the urban middle class, not too good, but for much of the discussion I was constantly thinking of certain Soviet propaganda films, the most famous one being the electrification of the Soviet Union, which usually shows peasants who had previously lived in darkness turning switches and now being brought into a community rather than isolated in darkness. Now clearly there's a propaganda element in that, but that doesn't deny a certain element to it, which preserves the notion of the magic of the light, but renders it into an entirely different political and economic environment.
Right.
That, I don't know if you consider that.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, there are a couple things. One is that the installation of electrical systems is definitely inequitable, you know, as many other utilities were. So there is a class distinction, discussion that needs to be had about all of that. But I think the same way that cities compete to have the tallest building, cities competed to have, I mean, definitely the best Great White Way. So there were, and these are always compared to New York's Great White Way, which ultimately becomes Times Square. So there's a competition there. But in, say, Roosevelt's rural electrification program, there's a similar sort of discussion, The themes are quite different, because it's often not communal, but it's about how the family farm is made more viable. It's usually the boy showing the parents how to use electricity. There were 4-H clubs that had, what do you call it, contests for making lamps and had lamp-making kits. So you could, and even in the blackout, they had, ways to make blackout shades. So it was a way to get the whole family involved. And it was, I think it was part of the promise of, the American dream, this kind of extension of urban amenity without urban liabilities to the entire landscape. So, it'd be very interesting to compare Soviet rural electrification with the American version.
So they're exactly contemporary in
Yeah.
respects.
Yeah.
For Roosevelt, Stalin.
And also, cities like Berlin, for instance, was very interested in the 20s in competing with New York and London in terms of lighting, and they had, in 1928, this Berlin in Licht festival that was, radical, really kind of progressive. So I think that was, that was a kind of locus of competition. And having a great white way was equivalent to having a bank and a church, town green, as part of urbanity. And so, in fact, in, what was it, like 1918, there were 220 great white ways in the United States, and all of them claiming to be somehow better. Los Angeles, for instance, said its great white way, which was like Broadway and Spring Street in what's now downtown, its great white way was brighter than New York's on a per capita basis. So it wasn't absolutely brighter, it was such a smaller city that it was effectively brighter. And I thought, that's a great argument. Yeah.
So you started your presentation tonight and you mentioned the automobile and the workspace and Great White and Times Square. So how are you planning to fit the switch into this kind of progression?
Yeah, so the idea is that it moves in scale from the switch, the automobile headlight, the factory floor, the urban district, and then the blackout, which is kind of environmental. And again, in a way, all I want to do is write a very conventional architectural history and say these are all spaces. They're not bricks and stone or steel and glass, but they're all spaces with social implications, oftentimes gendered, and they're formations, spatial formations of modernity. And so I want to consider these to be modern architecture. Just, it's not really stylistic, but they're spaces. So it's very simple and retrograde in a way. That's the goal. So the switch, the space is, that's what I was saying, the space is that sort of immediate visual expansion. It's not, and it is a physical space. It might be that flashlights come into it, I'm not sure. But they're early, they're an early technology, so. And again, what surprises me about a lot of this is the range of literatures that it crosses. So all of them have medical dimensions, legal dimensions, they appear in popular venues in different ways. But yeah, so that's the arc of the book. We'll see. Thanks. Yeah.
The other space that goes along with this, along with the electrical space, is the oral space that develops with the advent of radio.
Yes.
And the incredible, enormous change of what happens when silence is replaced by music coming from New York, also returns.
Yeah.
Or from, and those two things together, I think. It might be interesting to think about, the visual space and the oral space as being very much connected in terms of the transformation of a certain moment of consciousness changing and everything that's implied in that.
In the blackout that that's definitely true because it's suddenly non-visual. And so the other senses come to the fore, including, smell and touch and hearing. And I should say is that, I didn't expect it, but as that chapter or article developed, it started following in the history of the senses, that whole field of study, which I didn't know much about, but I got really interested in. And so that piece appeared, the blackout piece appeared as an article in, I think it's called The History of the Senses. It's a journal, the circulation maybe 200. But there's a society for the history of the senses. And what was nice is that they're mostly interested in, pushing back against the visual because it's obviously so powerful. So this was, they liked it, I think, in part because it was visual, but it was the absence of the visual. And it went across the senses. And it was really, reading about how to use smell in a blackout was really interesting. Yeah.
Don't forget, I actually have a friend who collects these, but I just grabbed one the other day, vintage doorbells and the doorbell buttons and the home and that whole push button.
Right.
Importance.
Yeah, the buttons they're everywhere. Part of the problem in dealing with electricity is that it keeps wanting to expand outward. So I'm really, I've been keeping it focused on light, but you can't, you're right, you can't ignore these other buttons.
I wanted to ask a question about the overlap between gas and electricity. I thought that was a really fascinating point, and there was a regional difference, and obviously there's certain kinds of economic interests in one system over the other, and then also there's different kinds of discourse about electricity versus gas. But certainly in gas, right, there's some similar things when it's first introduced about the fear and
Right.
Explosion and stuff. But also, so I'm just wondering, that if you could expand upon that point you made about the difference between the East Coast and West Coast in terms of the adoption.
Yeah, I think, as I said, the Union have entrenched gas industries in the West, so electric's adopted. But what's pretty interesting is that electricity comes in. It's a bright light. People talked about the transition from yellow light to white light as being very disruptive. And electricity looks poised to eclipse gaslight, except for the German chemist Welsbach, who invents the Welsbach method in the 1890s. And then gas becomes suddenly viable for another 25 years. So in the late teens, in the 19-teens, electrical equipment manufacturers are making piping that can accommodate both fixtures. So you can turn the little, like a little pedaled frosted glass open globe upward for gas or downward for an electrical. And as you saw in the Edison patent image, you could run the wiring through gas. So they were seen as being kind of compatible, and the transactions of the Illuminating Engineering Society, which I've gone through issue by issue, those two technologies are really kind of equivalent.
So how does someone like ComEd deal with that kind of performance?
Well, they're pushing electricity, but gas is pretty entrenched. There are they're mayors of cities. There was, I forgot the city. It was I think in North Dakota or Minnesota. The mayor was a major shareholder in the gas company, and he refused to let electricity in town. He refused to grant permits for that until there was just so much pressure. And then eventually electricity improves. The manufacturers are kind of relentless in developing new appliances. So that's part of the push button imagery that we saw, the discussion of the push button age, is that there are loads of new appliances. And that picture of the magic switch, the Habershoff company, I didn't point it out, but on the table is an electric percolator, an electric toaster. In the back are two different kinds of electric lights. Near their feet is an electric heater. So there's a lot of electricity in that image.
And gas is an early version of the dimmer, right? Because with the gas.
Because you can change,
so
right.
it's kind of a product.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of theatrical.
Right, exactly.
Early theatrical
Yeah.
effect.
I've been kind of curious about the first decade of the 20th century where buttons and wiring and like plugging things into ceiling lights and, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I mean, it's weird because there's this literature that seems to say that there's this, all these great advances in electrification, but there's a limitation in access and it's not necessarily aesthetically pretty.
Right.
And, do you think that that might, we've been having trouble finding images of, say, lamps in domestic interiors, from, say, 1900 to 08, or I don't know what, but do you think that that might be because of the messiness of wiring situation?
No, I mean, some houses that were designed with wiring, to be hidden. And again, this is sort of the device paradigm. We don't want to see that stuff. We want it hidden. But there were overhead outlets, and those were often used for irons, so you could move the ironing board underneath and, plug it in and iron. There are some messier installations, if someone didn't want to go through the walls, but it generally was a privilege of wealth, until cities started electrifying. And I should say before this, and before gas certainly, there were civic ordinances that required private lighting. So if you wanted to shop with street frontage, you might be required in, London or Los Angeles or Paris to put a lamp out front. So it's public lighting by ordinance, but it's privately owned. Cities get involved in the provision of infrastructure with gas in part. And then electricity, even though there's still a lot of private interest. So I think it might not have been quite as messy, when they're installed, though I do recommend seeing Buster Keaton's The Electric House.
Yeah.
Has anyone seen that? You know that. So from 1920 or 22, he gets a degree. He earns a degree in hairdressing, but is accidentally given a degree in electrical engineering. And the man giving the commencement speech hires him to electrify his house. He takes the job, and everything is fine for about the first minute. And then it's a fiasco, and it's hysterical, and tragic the way Keaton is.
I think we have time for one more question, so Michelle.
So you show a lot of images of men, sort of the phone pushing a button, and the lights come on, president and so on. And you talked about the gender, the car with the headlights and what to do with the blackout. But you showed one image of a woman as the figure of electricity. So I was wondering if there were other images.
Yeah, well, there are
and
figures
how
of.
she's depicted and from when.
Yeah.
And is there any element of danger in a woman being a figure of electricity, or how is that?
There were a couple of in domestic settings, women are pressing buttons. So there were two pictures of women pressing buttons.
There's that one image of a woman in the middle, in the center.
Yeah. Right. And so the posters, there are posters for a number of electrical expositions, and quite often, it's a female figure almost always, other than Prometheus. Prometheus doesn't have that web of wires around him, but the women are often depicted as the center of a lot of uses for electricity, and she usually has a lamp in one hand, and sometimes her hand either on a telephone, it's electricity in general, or a switch at the other side. Is there a dangerous element? I would say the intention would be no, because these are promoting electrical expositions, of which there were quite a few. So it's meant to be positive promotion. I think you could still kind of launch an interpretation that would find that dangerous element. But the fact that Prometheus is also a kind of common stand-in, obviously for delivering fire. I don't know. I'd look at that. I could look at that some more. But I would say definitely the image of the switch in the domestic sphere involves women. And even in these wire thrillers, they're very often women who are turning on the lights. In the public realm, and certainly by political leaders, it's men. It'd be interesting to find the first the first account I could find of a woman pressing the button. But definitely, and in other realms like the automobile, it's heavily gendered.
Well, thank you so much. It was a really fascinating talk and a really amazing array of evidence that you're pulling together. So thank you again, Sandy. Sandy might have a few minutes to address individual questions.
Well, thank you all. Appreciate it.